My name is Clara Whitfield. I'm 38 years old. I'm a registered nurse, the eldest grandchild of a woman named Evelyn, and someone who spent most of her life being the only person in her family who understood that my grandmother was extraordinary. I want to tell you about the morning my family sat in a solicitor's conference room and discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about a woman they had spent decades quietly underestimating. But before I tell you what happened in that room, I need you to understand something about my grandmother, about who she actually was, as opposed to who the family had always believed her to be. Evelyn served as an Army nurse during the Korean War. She was 22 when she deployed. She came home 4 years later, finished her nursing qualification, and spent the next 30 years as a community nurse in the area where she had grown up. She retired at 62. She lived in the same house for 50 years. She drove modest cars and wore sensible clothes and took no holidays, and spent her money on almost nothing visible. At every family gathering I can remember, someone made some version of the same gentle, pitying comment about Grandma Evelyn's simple circumstances. They said it with love. They genuinely meant it with love. But it was the love of people who had never once looked closely at what they were talking about. My grandmother died 3 weeks before the morning I'm about to describe. She was 89. She died in the hospital room where I'd been sitting with her for the better part of 3 months, and she died quietly, which is not always a given, and which I have come to understand as its own form of grace. 3 weeks after her death, the family gathered at a solicitor's office for the formal reading of her estate. My mother, Patricia, was there, my 2 aunts, my uncle Gerald, 3 of my cousins. We sat around a conference table that smelled of carpet cleaner and old wood, in the specific mid-morning light of an office building where the blinds were always half closed. The solicitor's name was Mr. Hartley. He was a precise, unhurried man who had managed Evelyn's affairs for 22 years and who gave no indication, throughout the preliminary portions of the reading, of what was coming. He read the standard language. He worked through the property, the contents of the house, the personal bequests, a piece of jewelry to each of her children, or a small sum to a local nursing charity she had supported for decades. Then he arrived at the primary asset. He said the amount clearly and without pause. $12 million. A trust, established 22 years earlier, managed by a financial institution, built from a combination of decades of disciplined saving and a significant inheritance from a fellow nurse named Ruth, Evelyn's closest friend after the war, who had died without family of her own and who had left everything she had to the person she trusted most with it. The trust had a single named beneficiary: my name. The room went silent, in the specific way of rooms where something has just altered the meaning of everything inside them. My mother made a sound that was not a word. My Aunt Barbara reached for the edge of the table. My Uncle Gerald said, that can't be right." His voice was flat, not angry yet, just disbelieving. Mr. Hartley looked at him. He said, "I can confirm that it is correct." I sat very still with my hands in my lap. My face was doing the work I had been preparing it to do for 4 weeks. Because I had known about the trust for 4 weeks, my grandmother had told me in the hospital 11 days before she died, on an afternoon when the room smelled of antiseptic and the particular warmth of a radiator that had been running since October. She had asked the nurse to close the door. She had waited until we were alone, and then she had told me everything. I want to tell you who Evelyn was before I tell you who the family believed her to be, because these are two very different stories about the same woman. She was the youngest of three sisters, born in 1934 in a small town in the north of England. Her father worked at a factory. Her mother managed the house and three children on very little and with considerable skill. Evelyn trained as a nurse at 19 and deployed with the Army at 22. When she came home, she brought with her a quietness that the family attributed to her personality, and that I have come to understand was something she earned in field hospitals over 4 years and chose never to fully describe to anyone who hadn't been there. She met my grandfather, a soft-spoken man named Albert, in 1959. They married and had 4 children, my aunts Helen and Barbara, my uncle Gerald, and my mother Patricia, who was the youngest by 6 years. Albert died when I was 4. I don't remember him. Evelyn spent the 35 years after his death alone, which is to say, in the specific self-sufficient independence of someone who had always been more competent than anyone around them fully recognized. My mother, Patricia, is the youngest of Evelyn's children. She is warm and social, and she loves her family genuinely. She organized Christmas gatherings and birthday celebrations, and the family's sense of itself is close. She also, like the rest of Evelyn's children, loved her mother in the particular way of people who have decided, without quite knowing they've decided it, that they already understand who someone is. They knew Evelyn. She was small and practical and kind and modest. They knew her house and her car and her sensible shoes. They knew the version of her that came to dinner and sent birthday cards and baked the same biscuit recipe every Christmas. They did not know what she carried. They never asked. I asked. From the time I was old enough to sit still and listen, which my mother tells me was younger than most children, I would find Evelyn in the kitchen at family gatherings and ask her questions. What was it like? What did you see? What was Ruth like, the friend she mentioned? What did the hospital tent smell like? What happened to the patients you couldn't help? She answered me. Not everything. Some things she held back with the quiet firmness of someone who has made peace with not sharing certain rooms. But she answered more than she answered anyone else. Because I kept asking. Because I came back the following week and asked again. The family found this attachment a little strange. I was the quiet grandchild who preferred the company of an old woman to most other available options. They said it affectionately. But they said it in the tone of something that is slightly puzzling about you. And I noticed. Let me tell you about 3 moments that I have thought about many times since the will reading, because they explain something important about how a family can love someone and still fail to see them. I was 14. It was Christmas Day. The whole family was at Evelyn's house, which meant the sitting room was loud and warm and smelled of whatever she'd been cooking since early morning. I was sitting beside Evelyn in the corner near the window, which was where we always ended up at family gatherings, and she was telling me about a particular week during her deployment. It was not a happy story. It was honest in the way that only very honest people are willing to be. Her voice was low, and her hands were in her lap, and she was looking slightly past me in the way she looked when she was actually back there, rather than simply describing it. My mother came through the room on her way to the kitchen. She glanced at us. She said, "Mom, don't fill her head with all that old stuff." She said it with a warm smile, the kind that communicated she was being sensible on my behalf. Evelyn stopped mid-sentence. She looked at my mother. She smiled the smile I came to recognize as the one she wore when she was deciding not to explain herself. She said, "You're probably right. It's not very interesting anyway." I looked at my grandmother in that moment, and I saw something happen in her face that she did not intend for me to see. A small closing. The particular adjustment of a person who has been told, without anyone meaning it unkindly, that what they have to say is not worth the space it takes up. I said, "I think it's interesting." Quietly, she patted my hand. We didn't talk about it again that day. 8 years later, I enrolled in a nursing degree. I told my family at a Sunday gathering. My cousins said congratulations. My Aunt Barbara said, "Like Grandma, how sweet." She meant it as a compliment. She was making a connection she thought was warm. What it communicated was that my professional choice was being understood as sentimental imitation rather than independent decision. As though wanting to do the same work as someone you admired was a slightly softer version of actually wanting something for yourself. Nobody asked what drew me to nursing. Nobody asked about the specialization I had chosen, or the hospital I was aiming to work at, or what I had done to get in. They said it was sweet and moved on to something else. Evelyn was at the other end of the table. She caught my eye, and she gave me a look that said two things at once. "I see what just happened, and I'm proud of you anyway." I held that look for a moment, and then I looked back at my plate. There was a gathering. I think I was 28, when Evelyn was in her late 70s. She drove herself to my mother's house in the car she had been driving for 12 years. It was reliable and clean and completely unglamorous, and my Uncle Gerald thought it was a source of gentle family entertainment. He said she should let them buy her something decent. He said it with real affection. The table laughed. Someone made a comment about how she drove it like it was a Rolls-Royce. Evelyn smiled and said the car suited her fine. I didn't laugh. I watched her smile and I thought, not for the first time, about how consistently the family found her simple life amusing in the specific way of people who feel gently superior to something they love. I didn't know, at 28, what the real picture was. I had no idea about the trust or Ruth or the $12 million. None of that knowledge existed for me yet. But even without it, I was the only person at that table who was not laughing. And I've thought about that many times since. Have you ever watched someone you love be underestimated by the people who were supposed to know them best? If that question finds something real in you, stay with me. Q, because this story is about what it looks like when someone decides that the person who truly saw them should be the one who benefits from a lifetime of being truly seen. By the time I was in my mid-30s, I was a registered nurse working in the intensive care unit of a hospital in the city where I had trained. I was not wealthy. My salary was professional, but not generous, which is a description that applies to most nurses and which the people who rely on nurses tend to forget when they're not currently relying on us. I rented a small flat. I had a modest savings account. I was repaying a student loan in careful monthly increments that I had built into my budget from the day I qualified. I managed my money the way I managed most things, with attention and without much room for error. I visited Evelyn every week, not as a duty. As a choice that I made every week because being in her kitchen was one of the places I felt most clearly like myself. I would drive over on a Sunday afternoon or a free weekday evening, and she would have the kettle on before I knocked, and we would sit at the table she had sat at for 50 years, and we would talk about things that were real: her past, my work, the patients she remembered, and the patients I was carrying that week. She always asked about the patients. She understood what I was describing in a way that came from having been exactly where I was 50 years earlier, in harder circumstances, and with less equipment, and without anyone to debrief to at the end of a shift. 3 years before she died, Evelyn had a cardiac episode that required hospitalization. I was the one who was called. Not because my mother and aunts and uncle weren't reachable, but because Evelyn had put my number first on her contact list, which is its own kind of statement that nobody in the family noticed or commented on. I arrived at the hospital before anyone else. I spoke to the doctors. I understood the discharge instructions because I speak that language fluently. I arranged the follow-up care with her GP and her cardiologist. And that night, when visiting hours had technically ended and Evelyn said she slept better with someone in the room, I found a chair and I stayed. The rest of the family came. They brought flowers, which was kind. They asked how she was, which was appropriate. They stayed for between 40 minutes and an hour, which was the amount of time that felt like enough. Then they went home and resumed their lives. I drove home the following morning, having slept in a chair, showered and changed, and went to my shift. I also, across those years, paid for things. Small things mostly, but real ones. When Evelyn's boiler failed one February and the repair quote was more than she had liquid that month, I paid for the repair. When she needed a dental procedure her plan didn't fully cover, I covered the difference. When her hip began to deteriorate and the mobility aid she needed was more than I thought was reasonable for her to manage alone, I found the right equipment and I paid for most of it. I never told the family about any of this because I knew what they would have said, that Evelyn had enough to cover her own costs, and they would have been technically correct and completely missing the point. She needed it. I was there. I paid for it. I did not know, when I paid for the boiler, that my grandmother had $12 million in a managed trust. I did not know about Ruth or the investment or any of it. I gave because she needed something, and I had the means to help, and there was no version of my relationship with Evelyn in which I would walk past that need and do nothing. That is the thing I need you to understand before I tell you what happened in the hospital room 11 days before she died. Evelyn's final 18 months were a gradual process of becoming smaller, not dimmer. She remained sharp and specific and deeply present in her mind right until near the end. But her body was winding down in the quiet, methodical way of a very old person who has used themselves fully and is now returning the resources. I was beside her for most of it. I reorganized my schedule. I took on fewer additional shifts. I drove to the hospital on my days off and sat with her, and we talked about everything and nothing, and I held her hand, and she held mine. The other family members came. I want to be fair about this because fairness matters in a story like this. They came. They sat with her. They loved her. The difference was in the hours and in the kind of presence. But they came. It was an ordinary Tuesday afternoon in late October when Evelyn asked the ward nurse to close the door. I looked up from the book I had been reading aloud, which we had been doing in the afternoons because she liked the sound more than the television. The room smelled of antiseptic and the slightly stale warmth of hospital heating, and the particular smell of cut flowers that were 2 days past their best, which someone had brought the previous weekend. The nurse closed the door and left us. Evelyn looked at me. Her eyes were clear. Not the clarity of a person performing clarity, but the actual full clarity of a mind that knows exactly what it is doing. She said, "I want you to know something before I'm gone." She told me about the trust. She told me about Ruth, her closest friend after the war, a nurse named Ruth Hensley, who had never married and had no surviving family, and who had died 15 years earlier, leaving everything she had to Evelyn, because Evelyn was the person she trusted completely. She told me how she had managed the money across the 22 years since the trust was established, quietly and without drama, with the same careful attention she had applied to everything in her life. She said she had chosen me as the sole beneficiary, not because she loved the others less. She was clear about this. She said she loved all of her children and she loved all of her grandchildren. But she said I was the only one who had ever sat with her, as though she was a complete and full person, rather than a family fixture. She said I had asked her questions about her life for 30 years. She said she had asked questions about mine in return. She said, "You listen to me. That matters more than people understand." She asked me to say nothing until after the reading. I said I wouldn't. I kept that promise for 4 weeks, including through her death, which came quietly on a Wednesday morning when I was beside her, and which I will not describe further because some things belong only to the people present, including through the funeral, which was attended by more people than the family expected, many of them elderly, several of them former colleagues and patients who had driven significant distances to be there, including through the weeks of family gatherings and phone calls in which my mother and aunts and uncle discussed the estate in the particular, practical way of people who are expecting something modest and are beginning to plan around it. My Aunt Helen mentioned the house. My Uncle Gerald mentioned some jewelry he thought might be valuable. My mother said she hoped there might be something for each of the grandchildren, a small memory of Grandma, something to keep. I sat through every one of these conversations with the thing I was holding inside me, managed carefully behind my expression. And I said nothing. I said the right words when words were required, and I held the rest. The morning of the reading, the family dressed in the specific way of people attending something formal, but not entirely solemn. Smart, but not severe. Expectant, but trying not to appear so. We gathered in the waiting area of the solicitor's office and made conversation about traffic and the weather and whether anyone wanted coffee. I drank mine. I sat in the chair I was given. And I waited. I've already told you what happened in that room, the number, the name, the silence. What I want to tell you now is what happened in the 3 days after. The room's reaction was not dignified. Dignity is difficult to maintain in the face of $12 million arriving where you didn't expect it. My Aunt Helen cried She said it wasn't fair. She said it in the specific tone of a person who believes fairness is a relevant concept in the distribution of another person's freely given assets. My uncle Gerald said there must have been some kind of influence. He said the word manipulation while looking directly at me. My mother was the last to speak, and what she said was the thing that affected me most. She said, quietly, to no one in particular, and to the woman who was no longer present to hear it, "I'm your daughter, Mom." There was real grief in that. I want to be honest about this. It was not performance. It was a woman who had just understood, in a very particular and irreversible way, that her mother had kept an entire life from her. Not the money, the fullness, the depth, the 40 years of kitchen conversations that she had never known were happening. Yet I felt something for her in that moment that was complicated. Compassion, genuinely, and also the specific, cold recognition that the distance my mother felt from her own mother's interior life was not something Evelyn had hidden. It was something the family had never tried to cross. 3 days after the reading, I went back to Mr. Hartley's office alone. I reviewed the trust documentation in full. It was airtight, as I had expected it to be. Evelyn had been careful with everything. She had been careful with this. I also consulted, on Joe's recommendation, a solicitor of my own, a woman named Angela who specialized in estate disputes and who, after reviewing the documentation, confirmed that there was no realistic mechanism for challenge. The trust was 22 years old. It was established at a time when Evelyn was in full possession of her faculties and fully independent. It was legal, documented, and complete. I made 2 decisions in the week after the reading. The first was simple. I would not apologize for receiving what my grandmother had chosen to give me. Not to my uncle, not to my aunts, not to anyone. This was Evelyn's decision, made over 22 years of careful, private deliberation, and it required no apology from me. The second decision required more thought. My uncle had begun making comments, not at the reading itself, but afterward, to family members and peripherally to people outside the family, that implied the trust was the result of an elderly woman being managed by the person who spent the most time with her. The word influence was being used, and the word manipulation had been used once, directly to me, at the reading. I was not going to let that version of the story stand unchallenged. Not for my sake, for Evelyn's. Joe and I had worked beside each other in the ICU for 6 years. She was 41, practical and clear thinking, and entirely without sentimentality about difficult situations, which made her extremely good at her job and extremely useful as a friend. She had known Evelyn the way you know a colleague's family member when that family member is frequently mentioned across years of shared shifts, through accumulated detail, through the stories told during long nights, through watching the person beside you take a call and knowing from their face exactly who is on the other end. When I told Joe about the trust and about the family's reaction, she listened to the whole account without interrupting. Then she asked what I wanted the outcome to be, not what I wanted to say or what the family deserved to hear, what I wanted the outcome to be. I said I wanted the record to exist. I wanted my uncle to stop being able to describe what had happened as manipulation without someone in the room providing the accurate version. I wanted the people who had known my grandmother for decades to have the true account of our relationship, because the true account was the only thing that could make sense of a decision that looked, from outside, like favoritism and was in reality something much more specific than that. Joe pointed out that there was a memorial lunch scheduled at my mother's home, an occasion organized to remember Evelyn, attended by all of Evelyn's children, their partners, and the grandchildren, and several family friends. Approximately 16 people, people who had known the family for years and who were, at this point, operating on partial information. Joe said, "That is the room." She also said something I have thought about many times since. She said she knew I was not a natural public speaker, which was true. And she said that didn't matter in this situation because I wasn't being asked to perform. I was being asked to deliver information clearly in a setting that required it. She said, "You've told families their person isn't coming home. You've sat across from a father and explained what happened and why there was nothing more that could be done. You can tell your family the truth about yours." She was right, and the specific kindness of reminding me that I already had the skill I needed is the kind of thing I will not forget. The memorial lunch was on a Saturday in late November. My mother had arranged the house carefully in the way she arranged everything: food on the table, fresh flowers, a photograph of Evelyn on the sideboard that had been enlarged and framed. The photograph was from Evelyn's nursing years. She was in uniform. She was 24. The family had never seen this photograph before I brought it, because I was the one who had gone through Evelyn's old boxes in the weeks before she died and found it and asked if I could have it enlarged. Looking at it now, in my mother's sitting room, I felt the weight of what that photograph represented. A woman in full, seen clearly, at the beginning of a life that was much larger than the family had ever understood. The atmosphere in the room was the careful warmth of people navigating something unresolved beneath the surface of a social occasion. People talked about Evelyn with the warmth that arrives more reliably after death than before it. They told the stories they knew: the Christmas biscuits, the small house, the reliable old car. They loved her in the way they always had loved her, in the version they had always held. Then, about an hour into the afternoon, my Uncle Gerald made a comment. He was standing near the fireplace with two family friends and a cousin. He spoke at a volume that was not quite a private conversation. He said that it was a complicated situation and that he wasn't sure a person of Evelyn's age, toward the end, he fully understood the implications of arrangements that had been made during a period when she was spending a great deal of time with one particular person. He said it in the language of concern. He said the word appropriate. The people nearby responded with the silence of people who aren't certain what they're agreeing to, but don't want to disagree. I put down my cup. I stood up. I spoke at a normal volume in a voice that was entirely steady. I said I wanted to share something about my relationship with Evelyn, because I thought the people in the room deserved accurate information before anyone formed a view about what had or hadn't been appropriate. The room quieted. My mother looked at me. Gerald looked at me. I did not look at either of them. I looked at the space between the people I was speaking to, and I spoke clearly, and the way I spoke at work when clarity was what the situation needed. I described the relationship from the beginning. Not the whole 40 years, but the shape of it. The visits that happened outside family events. The conversations about Evelyn's nursing years The hospitalization 3 years ago, the overnight stays in the hospital chair, the medical appointments I drove her to, the groceries I brought on the weeks she couldn't manage the shopping independently. I named the boiler repair. I named the dental bill. I named the mobility aid and the approximate cost. I named dates where I remembered them and said approximately where I did not. Then I reached into my bag and I took out a folded letter. It was a letter Evelyn had given to Mr. Hartley before she died, to be held with the estate documentation and provided to the beneficiary after the reading. It was addressed to the family. It was written in Evelyn's handwriting, which was still precise and clear even in her late 80s, and it was 3 paragraphs long. I said I was going to read it aloud. I read it. Evelyn's voice, in her own words. She said that she loved all of her children and their families fully and without qualification. She said her decision about the trust was not a statement of comparative love. She said it was a statement of trust specifically and of recognition. She said Clara had treated her as a full person across 40 years. She said that she had been listened to and asked questions and sat with in hospitals and driven to appointments and helped with things that needed helping with. And that all of this had been done without any knowledge of the trust and without any expectation of anything in return. She said that this kind of relationship, of being truly seen by another person across a long life, was rarer and more valuable than money. She said she wanted what she had built to go to the person she trusted most to do something worthy with it. She said she hoped the family would come, in time, to understand. I folded the letter. The room was very quiet. My Uncle Gerald was looking at the fireplace. My Aunt Helen had her hand over her mouth. My mother was looking at the photograph of Evelyn on the sideboard, the one in the nursing uniform, the one none of them had known existed. I said I was not asking for anyone's approval of my grandmother's decision. I was asking that the word manipulation no longer be used in connection with it. Then I sat down and I picked up my cup, and I let the room find its way back to itself. The weeks that followed were not simple. I did not expect them to be. My Uncle Gerald did not call to apologize. He did not come to me directly. But the comments stopped. The word manipulation disappeared from the family's vocabulary, at least in any version that reached me. I understood this withdrawal without acknowledgement for what it was. The closest available form of a response from a man who was not constitutionally capable of something more direct. I accepted it. I did not hold it against him more than was reasonable. My Aunt Helen called twice. The first call was emotional and slightly circular, returning to the same central feeling, that the outcome of the will represented a rejection of the rest of the family by a woman they had loved. I let her talk. I didn't argue with the feeling, because the feeling was real, even if the interpretation wasn't quite right. I said, I think Grandma loved all of you. I think she also made a decision about what she could trust me to do with what she had built, and those two things are not the same. The line was quiet for a moment. Then she said she supposed she understood that. The second call, a week later, was shorter. She asked if she could have a copy of the letter. I said yes. I sent it the same day. My mother took a full month? That was right. I had known it would take a full month. Patricia had received information about her own mother that she had not had access to for 67 years, and a month was not an unreasonable amount of time to sit with that. When she called, Her voice was different from the voice she used for most things. Quieter, more careful. She said she knew she hadn't understood her own mother the way I had. She said she didn't know what she had missed, or what questions she should have asked, or why she hadn't asked them. She said she thought she had been in the same room as her mother for 67 years, and that she now understood she hadn't been in the same room at all. She said she was sorry, not for the will, not for the outcome. She said she was sorry for the years of not asking, for the years of the warm, slightly pitying affection that had kept her at exactly the distance needed to never really know the woman she loved. I told my mother that I believed Evelyn knew she was loved. I believe this. I told her that Evelyn had spoken about all of her children with genuine warmth across 40 years of kitchen conversations. She had. I told her that the distance was something that could be grieved without it needing to be anyone's fault. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Thank you." The first thing I did with the money, before anything else, before property or investment decisions or anything that required a longer view, was to establish a nursing scholarship in Evelyn's name at the hospital where Evelyn had trained. Sate worked with the hospital's charitable foundation to structure it so that it would fund one student per year from a background of financial disadvantage who was pursuing a nursing qualification. Ongoing, indefinite. Built to outlast me if I managed it correctly. The first recipient was chosen 6 months later. I attended the announcement. I didn't say much. I brought the photograph of Evelyn in her nursing uniform and left it with the foundation coordinator for their records. I began seeing a therapist 6 months after the will reading. Not because I was in crisis, because I was carrying something that needed more than my own resources to fully process. In those sessions, I worked through the specific, complicated grief of having loved someone completely, and then watched the people who also loved them realize, in a public and irreversible moment, that they had not loved them in the same way. That grief is not simple. It is not triumphant. It is the grief of recognizing that the person you treasured was invisible to the people who should have seen them, and that this invisibility was a loss that belonged to everyone and could not now be recovered. Evelyn was a full person who was never fully seen by most of the people who loved her. Her children loved a version of her. They loved the small house and the modest car and the Christmas biscuits and the warm, simple grandmother. They loved her genuinely. But they had stopped at the surface of her the way you stop at the surface of something when you've decided you already understand it. They never went further. They never asked. And she, being Evelyn, you accepted the version they held of her and kept the rest for the kitchen table conversations and the person who kept coming back to ask more questions. I continued nursing for another year after the reading, not because I needed the salary, though I was not ready to think of myself as someone who didn't, but because nursing was not what I did for money. It was what I did because it was the closest thing I had to doing the same work Evelyn had done, with the same values she had brought to it, in a world that had changed around that work, but not changed the center of it. I took care of people who needed careful taking care of. I did it because Evelyn had taught me, across 40 years of kitchen conversations, that this was the most important thing a person could choose to spend themselves on. I eventually moved to a less demanding schedule. I bought a property. I funded the scholarship. I set aside a portion of the trust for specific causes that Evelyn and I had discussed across the years: a veterans nursing organization, a small palliative care charity that she had believed in, a fund for community nurses working in underserved areas. These decisions did not happen quickly. I made them the way Evelyn had made her decisions, carefully, over time, without drama. If you have ever known someone who was fully present with you in a way that most people in your life were not, you understand what I am trying to say about Evelyn. She listened, not performatively, not politely. She actually listened in the specific, complete way of someone who is genuinely interested in the person in front of them. She remembered details. She asked follow-up questions weeks after a conversation. She treated my choices as legitimate, my interests as worthy of discussion, my grief as real, my professional work as meaningful, in the same full way she understood her own to have been meaningful. She gave me 40 years of that. I did not understand until I tried to describe it out loud, in my mother's sitting room with a letter in my hands, how rare that experience was, how much it had shaped everything about who I became. Leave a comment if you have known someone like that, a person who saw you fully and consistently across time. Because I think those people are rarer than we understand while we still have them, and I think we do not always know what they gave us until we try to explain it to a room full of people who are only now beginning to understand what they missed. So on a Sunday morning in January, before the house was sold as part of the estate, I arranged to visit it one last time. I had a key. I let myself in. The house smelled of the particular quiet of an empty space that has recently been lived in. Faint traces of the cleaning products the estate agent had used, and underneath that, something older and more specific that I recognized and could not name. The smell of 50 years in the same rooms. I went to the kitchen. I sat at the table. The kettle was gone. The chairs were still there. I put my hands flat on the table surface, the same table where we had sat across from each other for 40 years, and I looked at the window above the sink, where the winter light was coming through at the angle it always came through in January. I thought about all of it. About the 14-year-old girl at the Christmas gathering who said, "I think it's interesting," when her grandmother's story was interrupted. About the nursing degree and the house suite and the accumulation of small invisibilities across years. About the hospital chair. About the boiler and the dental bill and the mobility aid. About the letter, written in her own hand, that said she had been seen by someone who kept coming back to look. I thought about the number. $12 million, built quietly across a lifetime by a woman who wore sensible clothes and drove an old car and took no holidays and said nothing about any of it. Built with Ruth's inheritance and her own savings and 22 years of patient investment by a woman who understood better than anyone around her that what you do with your resources when no one is watching is the truest statement of who you are. I made myself a cup of tea with the box I had brought with me. I sat at the table. I drank it slowly. The kitchen was quiet in the way that kitchens are quiet when the person who belonged in them is gone, and the silence is the only thing left that remembers the shape of them. My family mocked my grandmother's simple life and thought they understood what she had and what she was worth. But Grandma Evelyn knew something they never learned, that a life spent genuinely listening to another person is worth more than anything you could put in a trust. She taught me that. And then, because she was Evelyn, she put it in a trust as well.